The castle corridors smelled of old stone, wood smoke and quiet lies. I kept my steps the way I'd practiced for years, not a sound, just a whisper of coarse wool against stone. My eyes were fixed on the floor, on the scuffed toes of the boots they'd given me. A good maid doesn't look up. A good ghost doesn't exist at all. I was Lily from Pinefall, a girl from a poor pack with no family and a need to work. It was the last place in the entire realm anyone would look for the silver fox. Alara, the head housekeeper, stopped before a set of towering doors carved with wolves running under a full moon. She smoothed her apron, her kind face pinched with a worry that seemed permanent here. "The Great Hall," she said, her voice hushed. "You'll be presented. Just keep your head down, girl. Answer if he speaks to you. Don't be afraid of him. Pity him if you must." Pity. That was the currency of the castle now. I nodded, letting my lower lip tremble just enough. "Yes, ma'am." The doors groaned open. The hall was vast, a canyon of cold, grey stone. High above, narrow windows let in shafts of pale, watery light that did nothing to warm the air. Tapestries depicting great hunts and battles hung still, their colours muted by dust and shadow. But the real spectacle was at the far end. On a raised dais of black marble sat the broken heart of the Stonehaven pack, Alpha King Viktor. He was draped in robes of charcoal grey, too fine for a man who never left his chair, yet they hung on him like a shroud. His hair, black as a raven's wing, and once the subject of ballads, fell lank over a forehead that seemed carved from granite, heavy with a grief everyone could feel. A thick, woven blanket covered his lap and legs, hiding the shape of the wheelchair beneath. But it was his stillness that struck the hall. It wasn't peace. It was the terrible, aching stillness of a mountain that had been hollowed out by an avalanche. The story said he used to move with the grace of a shadow and the certainty of a landslide. Now he was a monument to loss. A hollow ache, familiar and sharp, opened behind my ribs. I knew that kind of stillness. It was the silence that comes after everything you love is taken. To see a king, a man of such legendary power, reduced to this, it was a physical pain to witness. But I have survived by seeing what others miss, the false bottom in a merchant's money chest, the hidden latch on a lord's private journal, the truth behind a smiling face that wants you dead. And I saw the truth here. It was in his hands. They rested on the arms of the chair, large and powerful, the hands of a warrior, a young servant, barely more than a boy, scurried past the dice to light the sconces. In his haste, his elbow brushed a small jewelled dagger that lay on a velvet cushion beside the king's chair. The blade shifted, glinting. The king's right hand, the one closest to the dagger, tightened. It was instant, a flash of tendons standing out like cables, the knuckles bleaching white. Then, just as fast, it went limp again. A man truly lost in the fog of his own paralysis wouldn't have noticed. A man drowning in despair wouldn't care about a knife. But a king who was watching everything, who was setting a snare for the disloyal and the greedy, would. It was a reflex of protection, of ownership. He had just told me everything. He was pretending. The hollow pity in my chest froze, then shattered into 1,000 glittering, watchful pieces. The air in the hall seemed to thin. He wasn't the prey here, he was the hunter, and we were both wearing skins that didn't belong to us. "My king," Alara said, her voice soft but carrying in the hushed space. She gave me a gentle push forward. My feet, trained to be silent, scuffed deliberately on the stone, a nervous maid. "This is Lily. From the Pinefall pack to the south. She's to be your new personal attendant." I made myself smaller, folding my shoulders in, curving my spine. I focused on the cold marble of the dice steps. "My king," I stammered, letting the words tremble out. I was a mouse before a fallen eagle. Slowly, so slowly it seemed to cost him great effort, he lifted his head. His eyes found me. They were the colour of amber, of old honey held to the light. The songs said they could glow like coals when his wolf was near. Now they were flat, dull, glassy with a pain so profound it stole the breath from the onlookers. It was a masterpiece of deception. Fine. The single word was a dry rasp, the sound of a voice unused and crumbling. "She will do." He sounded utterly broken, but my ears, trained to listen for the faintest click of a lock or the shift of a guard's weight, heard it. Underneath the gravel and ruin was a timber, a resonance of power that had been muted, not destroyed. It was like hearing a great bell that had been muffled by thick wool, You couldn't hear the ring, but you could feel the deep, heavy silence where it should have been. That silence did not match the empty wreck of his face. Alara bowed, relief in the line of her shoulders, and pulled me back with a firm hand. As we retreated, I kept my head down, but my senses stretched out. I heard the whispered exchange from 2 guards by the door. Another one, she won't last a week. No one does. Why would she? Serving a ghost is bad luck. Poor thing. Poor thing. Poor thing. They meant me. They had no idea. Alara's instructions in the corridor were a torrent of whispered worry. His chambers, morning and evening. Build the fire, clear the trays, change the linens. Do not speak to him unless he asks you a direct question. Do not ever touch his desk. Do not look him directly in the eyes for too long. It agitates him. She clasped my hands, her own worn and warm. He is not the man he was, child. Be kind. I nodded, my eyes wide and wet. I will, ma'am. I'll be no trouble. You have no idea, I thought. My first real test came at dusk. Alara led me to a heavy oak door, simpler than the grand halls but still imposing. His private sitting room. He takes his supper here. Just clear the tray. Be quick, be quiet. She opened the door and nudged me inside. The room was a library, a study, and a sitting room all in one, lit by the dying fire and a single oil lamp. It was a cave of shadow and profound wealth. Shelves of books rose to the ceiling. A massive oak desk, its surface gleaming and clear, but for a single sheet of parchment, dominated one wall. Tapestries depicting constellations covered the stone. My thief's mind, against my will, began cataloguing. The servant's passage was likely behind the winter constellation tapestry. The lock on the desk was a sturdy iron Bransford, pickable but time-consuming, and that high, narrow window with the cracked latch led to a steep slate roof, and, eventually, the kitchen midden and the forest beyond, a perfect escape route. He was by the large window, his chair turned to watch the last smudge of violet light fade behind the mountains. He was just a silhouette against the gloom, the blanket a darker shadow on his lap. The silence was a thick, smothering velvet. It was the quiet of a watchful beast. I could feel his attention, like a physical pressure on the back of my neck, even though he hadn't moved. "Be the mouse," I commanded myself. Be small, be scared. I moved toward the small table where a silver tray held the remains of a meal. A bowl of broth, a hunk of bread mostly untouched, a delicate porcelain cup stained with the dregs of tea. I used the steps of a girl who is afraid, a hesitant shuffle that was in reality a perfectly balanced glide. My feet in their soft-soled shoes made no sound on the thick rug. I reached for the fine porcelain cup. My own hands, raw from the lye soap in the laundry, looked alien against its fragility. The thin, white scars across my knuckles and the back of my right hand, the legacy of a nobleman's blade when I'd been too slow, stood out starkly in the lamplight. I silently willed the shadows to swallow them. I lifted the cup. It was lighter than a bird's bone. "What is your name?" His voice, coming from the darkness by the window, was a shock in the perfect quiet. I let it startle me. I let my body jolt, my hand fumble. The cup clattered against the silver tray, a sharp, ringing sound that was terribly loud. "El Lily, my king," I whispered, directing my voice to the floor. I hunched my shoulders, becoming a ball of nerves. "Look at me, Lily." A chill, clean and sharp as a stiletto, slid down my spine. This was the moment. The hunter looking directly at the little mouse in his territory. I raised my head with a painstaking slowness that screamed of fear. I let my eyes, my ordinary mud-brown eyes, go wide and slightly unfocused. I filled them with the vacant, fearful look of a cornered animal. I aimed my gaze at the hollow of his throat where a pulse should beat, then let my eyes skitter away, unable to bear the contact. For a fraction of a heartbeat, less than the space between one breath and the next, our eyes met. In that instant, the dull amber was gone. The glassy sheen of pretended grief vanished. His eyes were alive, deep and intense, burning with a focused, penetrating intelligence. They were not the eyes of a broken man. They were the eyes of a sovereign assessing a new piece on his board. They flicked over my face, taking in the line of my cheekbone, the set of my mouth, and they lingered just for a flash on the scar on my knuckle. That scar, too straight, too clean for a kitchen accident, a fighting scar. He saw it. He saw me. Not Lily the maid, but the person hiding inside her skin, the one who knew how to be still, how to watch, how to lie. And I saw him, not the crippled king, but the powerful alpha, hidden in plain sight, his wolf simmering just beneath the surface of his human skin. The connection lasted only a moment before I shattered it, dropping my gaze back to the floor with a convulsive gasp, as if I'd been scalded. He said nothing for a long, heavy moment. I could feel his gaze on the top of my bowed head. "You may go," he said finally, his voice once more that empty, weary rasp. He turned his chair slightly back toward the window, dismissing me. "Yes, my king." The words were a breath. I gathered the tray, my movements deliberately clumsy now, the silver rattling. I backed toward the door, a servant properly cowed. Out in the cold, dark hallway, the heavy oak door shut behind me with a soft, final thud. I didn't move. I pressed my back against the rough, cold stone of the wall, the silver tray heavy in my hands. My heart was not hammering with the fear of a caught thief. It was beating a fierce, wild, exhilarating rhythm against my ribs. A slow smile, one I would never let show inside that room, touched my lips. It was the thrill of the game, the most dangerous game I'd ever played. He sat in his wheelchair, the picture of tragic weakness, thinking he was so clever, the mighty hunter playing the wounded stag to lure the coyotes and wolves out of the woods. He thought he was in control. He thought he was the only one here wearing a mask. He had no idea he'd just welcomed a fox into his den. And everyone who knows the old tales knows the fox always outwits the stag. We're quieter, we're smarter, and we bite back. 3 days. For 3 days, I played my part perfectly. I was Lily the ghost. I swept ashes from the hearth with a whisper-soft brush. I laid fresh logs without a single thump. I placed his supper tray and removed it, my eyes forever ever on the floor, my movements a study in timid efficiency. I was a wisp of grey wool, a servant so forgettable I might as well have been part of the furniture. And for 3 days, he watched me. He never said a word. He would sit by the window or near the fire, that damned blanket over his legs, his gaze fixed on some distant, painful point. But I could feel it, the weight of his attention like sun through a lens, focused and burning. He was testing the seams of my disguise, looking for a frayed edge. I gave him nothing. I was a closed book, written in a language he didn't know. On the 4th morning, everything changed. A commotion erupted in the West Wing just after dawn, a clash of angry voices that slithered under my door in the maid's dormitory. By the time I arrived in the king's chambers to build the fire, the castle was buzzing like a kicked hive. The story was everywhere, passed in hissed whispers between the scrubbing buckets. Lord Grayson, the king's most powerful and oily adviser, had been robbed in his own locked bedchamber. A treasured heirloom was gone, a silver goblet encrusted with moonstones, said to be enchanted to reveal poison. The only mark left behind was a single, sleek black feather on his windowsill, and a tiny, elegant symbol scratched into the wax of his melted candle. A stylized fox with a curling tail. The silver fox had struck right under the king's nose. When I entered the king's sitting room, the air was different, thicker. He wasn't at the window. He was at his massive desk, the blanket still over his legs, but before him lay a large piece of parchment. He was sketching, his large hand moving with a slow, deliberate grace that didn't match the story of ruined nerves. As I knelt at the hearth, I risked a glance. He wasn't drawing landscapes or portraits. He was drawing the fox symbol. Over and over. Each one was perfect, precise, an artist studying a subject. My blood ran cold. I focused on the fire, coaxing the kindling to life, my hands steady only through a lifetime of discipline. The scratch of his quill was the only sound. "The servants are talking of nothing else," he said suddenly, his voice that same dry, hollow rasp. He didn't look up from his sketching. "A thief in Stonehaven. An insult. What do you make of it, Lily?" The question was a trapdoor opening beneath my feet. I made my voice small, confused. "It is very bold, my king." "Bold," he repeated, the word like a stone dropped in a well. "Or desperate. Tell me, in your Pinefall pack, did you have much trouble with thieves?" I kept my back to him, blowing gently on the emerging flame. "No, my king, we had little worth stealing." A practical answer. The scratching stopped. I felt his gaze land between my shoulder blades. "Come here." Slowly I rose, wiping sooty hands on my apron. I approached the desk, my eyes lowered to the intricate wood grain. "Look." I lifted my gaze to the parchment. He had drawn a dozen foxes, each in a different style, cunning, sleek, laughing. In the centre he had carefully redrawn the symbol from Grayson's room. It was unnervingly accurate. It is a pretty mark, I whispered, forcing a vacant tone. Do you think so? He mused. I find it arrogant. A signature, a thief who wants credit. His finger, long and strong, tapped the paper next to the symbol. This was drawn by someone with a steady hand, an artist's hand, or a jeweller's, or a forger's. His eyes lifted from the paper and found my face. Your hands are steady, Lily, the room seemed to tilt. I let my breath hitch, injecting a tremor into my voice. From scrubbing, my king. They shake sometimes from the lie. I clutched them together, hiding the scars. He hummed, a non-committal sound. Then he reached not for the parchment, but for a small velvet pouch on his desk. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents onto the parchment beside the foxes. A single, sleek black feather drifted out. It was identical to the one left in Grayson's room. Identical to the ones I used, plucked from a raven I'd found dead in the woods 2 years ago, my calling card. It is a raven's primary wing feather, he said, his voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. Common enough in the forests, but this one... He picked it up, holding it to the grey light from the window. See the very tip? Faintest streak of silver. A pigment, perhaps, or a natural variation, distinctive. My mouth was dust. He had not just found a feather, he had studied it. He knew its details like a scholar. I wouldn't know, my king, I stammered, taking a half step back, the picture of a girl overwhelmed. His amber eyes held mine. The dullness was gone, replaced by a piercing, unnerving focus. Wouldn't you? He asked softly. He knew. He didn't have proof, but he knew. The recognition in his eyes wasn't suspicion, it was certainty. He had seen the shadow in me that first night, and now he was matching it to the shadow that had flitted through Lord Grayson's window. The facade of the broken king was still there, the blanket, the chair, the carefully slumped shoulders. But the man inside it was now leaning forward, a hunter who had finally caught the scent he'd been searching for. He wasn't confronting the silver fox. He was introducing himself. I find myself bored, Lily, he said, placing the feather deliberately back on the parchment. A king in a chair has little to do but think, and I think this fox and I might have a common interest. I couldn't speak. I just stared, the timid maid act frozen on my face. Lord Grayson, he continued, his voice dropping to a low confidential murmur that wouldn't carry past the rug, reports that his silver was stolen. But my other eyes tell me he reported only half the value of what was in that room to the guard. He is padding his pockets, using the theft as an excuse. He and others like him are like ticks on a dying stag, growing fat. His lip curled, a flash of the true king's disdain. They think the stag is dead. They are wrong. He was offering me a glimpse behind his mask, a dangerous, incredible offer. My king, I don't understand politics, I whispered, retreating into the Maid one last desperate time. A smile, thin and sharp as a blade, touched his mouth. It was gone in an instant. Of course not, he said, his tone shifting back to vacant dismissal. He waved a limp hand toward the hearth. Your fire is smoking, see to it. The dismissal was clear. The conversation was over. For now. I stumbled back to the fireplace, my mind screaming. He knew, and he wasn't having me dragged to the dungeons. He was intrigued. He'd as much as told me Grayson was corrupt. He'd hinted at a common enemy. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay my narrow cot, listening to the breathing of the other maids, and saw his eyes, those alive, amber, knowing eyes in the darkness. The game had shifted. It was no longer about hiding from him. It was about understanding what he wanted. A king who pretended to be broken was a king planning a reckoning. And he thought the silver fox could be useful for that. A wild, impossible thought took root. What if I wasn't just hiding here? What if this wasn't just a refuge, but a battlefield? And what if the king wasn't the warden, but a potential ally? The thought was more terrifying than any guard's chase. An ally meant trust. Trust meant vulnerability. Vulnerability got people like me killed. But as the moon traced its path across the cold floor, another thought followed. He had seen my shadow and hadn't raised an alarm. He had shown me his. In a world where everyone wore masks, that was a kind of recognition. A dangerous, electrifying recognition. The fox and the stag were no longer hunter and prey in the dark. We were two shadows in a lantern's glow, circling each other, waiting to see who would speak first. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled and thrilled me, that our silent war of observation was over. The real game was about to begin. The silence in the king's chambers the next day was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the hollow silence of defeat. It was the taut, watchful silence of a snare that has been sprung and is waiting for the final jerk. He said nothing more of foxes or feathers. He played his part perfectly, the listless king staring at the rain-streaked window. I played mine, the ghost maid who flinched at the sound of her own footsteps. But the air hummed with what had been acknowledged. The unspoken words hung between us like cobwebs, sticky and inescapable. The opportunity he had hinted at came sooner than I expected. That very night I had business of my own. Information I'd overheard from the guards. A corrupt tax collector from a nearby town, a man who had ruined families in Pinefall, was staying in the guest quarters. The fox had a score to settle, and his purse was the means. It was a risk so soon after the Grayson theft with the castle on edge. But I needed the money to secure a new escape route, and more than that, I needed to prove to myself, I still could, that the fox wasn't caged by the king's knowing gaze. I slipped from the maid's dormitory like smoke, my dark clothes blending with the stone. I was a shadow among shadows, the route I'd mapped from the king's own window clear in my mind. The collector's room was easy pickings. His lock was cheap, his snore was loud, and his purse was heavy with ill-gotten silver. I left no feather this time. This was personal, not a calling card. The return was always the most dangerous part. The descent from the roof, the shimmy down the old ivy to the kitchen midden, the dash across the open yard to the servants' entrance. The rain that had fallen all day had turned to a fine, freezing mist, slicking the stones. I was almost there, a few feet from the scullery door, when I stepped on a patch of hidden ice. My boot shot out from under me. I fell hard, biting back a cry as my knee and palm slammed onto the wet cobblestones. The purse of silver tucked inside my tunic gave a muffled but distinct clink. A torch flared to life not 10 paces away. "Who's there?" A guard's voice grumbled, steps squelching in the mud as he turned the corner. My heart stopped. I was pinned in the torchlight, dressed in dark, close-fitting clothes no maid would own, caught out of bed in the dead of night. There was no story to explain this. Before I could even think to run, a deeper voice cut through the mist, calm and absolute. "Stand down." From the other side of the yard, a figure emerged from the deeper gloom near the stables. He moved without a sound, a tall, cloaked shape. As he passed into the torchlight, the guard gasped and immediately bowed his head. "My king!" Viktor. He wasn't in his chair. He wasn't under his blanket. He stood tall, his shoulders broad and straight under a simple dark cloak, his posture one of effortless, commanding strength. The mask of the cripple was gone, completely. In its place was the alpha, his face a stark landscape of sharp angles and piercing eyes that reflected the torch flame. He didn't look at the guard. His gaze was fixed on me, huddled on the ground. I heard a disturbance from my window. "It is only my maid, Lily. I sent her to fetch a poultice from the stables for my aches." His voice wasn't the rasp he used in the halls. It was low, firm, and brooked no argument. "Return to your post." "Yes, my king." "Forgive me." The guard, thoroughly chastened and confused, hurried away, his torchlight fading around the corner. The silence he left behind was absolute and freezing. The mist coated my skin. I couldn't move, caught between the shock of the fall and the greater shock of seeing him like this. He had not just revealed himself to me, he had done it to save me. He walked toward me, his steps silent and sure on the slippery stones. He stopped, looking down. His eyes went from my face, pale with shock, to my muddy, torn trousers, to the telltale lump at my waist where the purse hid. "I told you the game had changed, Fox," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "Getting clumsy is a good way to lose it." He extended a hand, not the limp, pathetic hand of the crippled king, a strong, capable hand, palm up, waiting. I stared it. This was the moment of no return. To take it was to accept his help, to acknowledge the new terrifying rules. To refuse was to declare myself an enemy, and an exposed one at that. Slowly, my own hand trembling not from act but from sheer, wild adrenaline, I reached up. My cold, muddy fingers slid into his warm, dry grasp. His grip was firm, solid as granite. He pulled me to my feet in one smooth, powerful motion that left no doubt about his strength. I staggered, my injured knee protesting, and his other hand shot out to steady my elbow. The touch was brief, impersonal, but it burned through the fabric. We stood there in the misty dark, the king and the thief, no pretense between us now. "The poultice," he said, his voice returning to a more conversational side, though still quiet, tone. "You should fetch it, and then I think we need to talk. Properly, in my chambers, the south sitting room." His eyes held a clear meaning. The south room had no windows overlooking the busy courtyards. It was a box of stone, a private cage. He knew about the silver. He knew about my clothes. He knew everything, and he was inviting me in. I nodded, unable to speak. He released my arm, gave me one last unreadable look, then turned and melted back into the darkness from whence he came, as silent as any shadow. I stood there alone in the cold yard, the weight of the stolen silver suddenly feeling like a millstone around my neck. The thrill of the hunt was gone, replaced by a dizzying plunge into the unknown. The stag had not just seen the fox, he had cornered her. And now he was holding open the door to his den, waiting to see if she was brave enough or desperate enough to walk inside. The walk to the south sitting room was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to hold a guard. Every echo of my own damp, hesitant steps on the flagstones felt like an announcement of my guilt. The stolen silver in my tunic was a cold, accusing weight. I'd been caught. Not by a guard, but by the one person in this entire castle I could not outrun, outwit, or disappear from. The king's private south sitting room was small, warm, and utterly sealed. No windows, only shelves of ledgers and maps, and a single fierce fire crackling in a hearth of black granite. He was waiting for me. He had removed his cloak. He stood before the fire, his back to me, and even from behind, the transformation was breathtaking. The false weakness was gone. He was simply solid, a pillar of contained power. The shoulders I'd seen slumped under robes were broad and straight, the line of his spine unyielding. He didn't turn. "Close the door, Lily," he said. Not the rasp, not the command he'd used with the guard. This was a new voice, calm, even, a voice for negotiations in a locked room. I pushed the heavy door shut. The click of the iron latch was the sound of a cage locking. "Sit!" He gestured to one of two high-backed chairs facing the fire. I didn't move. I stood just inside the door, dripping mist and mud onto the expensive rug, a wild animal backed into a corner. My mind raced for exits, for lies, and found none. The truth hung between us, thick as the smoke from the fire. Finally he turned. In the firelight, his amber eyes were not dull, nor were they the piercing hunter's gaze from the yard. They were assessing, calculating. He looked at me not as a king looks at a servant, nor a man at a woman, but as one strategist looks at another. He saw the mud, the torn knee of my trousers, the defiant set of my jaw beneath the fear. "The silver fox," he said, the name a soft exhale. "You've been busy. Lord Grayson's moonstone goblet, Baroness Alara's emerald pendant last winter, the tax records that went missing from Duke Evermont's coach in the spring, leading to his corruption charges." He took a step closer, and I forced myself not to flinch. "You have a type, the cruel, the greedy, the ones who use their power to grind others into the dust." He knew it all. He'd been collecting the stories, connecting the dots I'd so carefully scattered. "Are you going to have me executed, my king?" My voice came out hoarse, but clear. It was the question that had been ringing in my head since the yard. I would meet my fate standing, not cowering. A faint, most imperceptible smile touched his lips. It held no warmth, only a sharp curiosity. "If I wanted you executed, Fox, you'd be in the dungeon already, and your head would be the topic of tomorrow's breakfast gossip." "No." He paced slowly to the other chair and sat, steepling his fingers. He moved with a predator's grace, no hint of the wheelchair's patient. "I want to make you an offer." I stared. This was not what I expected. An offer. "You have skills I lack," he said bluntly. "You move through shadows as if you were born in them. You see locks not as barriers, but as puzzles. You listen to whispers in halls even my ears cannot reach. And you have a particular moral code that aligns, interestingly enough, with my current needs." He leaned forward, the firelight carving deep lines of intent into his face. "My castle is infected. You've seen it. The pitying looks that hide contempt, the stolen silver, the disloyal whispers. Lord Grayson is the rot's head, but the roots spread wide. They think I am broken. They grow bold. They steal from the people, from the treasury, and they plan, I believe, to eventually steal the throne itself." He spoke with a cold, clean fury that was more terrifying than any shout. I have evidence, but not enough. They are careful. Their ledgers are false, their meetings secret. I need someone who can go where a king cannot, who can listen at keyholes they would guard against a guard, who can find the real books, the secret letters, the proof of treason locked in their private desks. He looked directly at me, his gaze holding mine prisoner. I need the silver fox. The audacity of it stole my breath. He was asking me, a thief, to spy for the king, to turn my skills against the very vipers I'd been robbing. And in return, I asked, my throat tight. In return, he said, his voice dropping to a low, definitive register, I give you 3 things. First, a full and complete pardon for every crime the fox has ever committed. It will be sealed and public. You will no longer be hunted. My heart gave a hard, painful thump. A pardon, freedom from the chase. It was a dream I'd never dared to have. Second, he continued, legal protection. A new, clean identity as a citizen of Stonehaven with papers that will stand up to any inquiry. No one will ever trace you back to Pinefall or to the Fox. A home, not just a hiding place, but a place. The words struck a chord so deep and aching I almost doubled over. And third, I whispered. Third, he said, and for the first time his voice lost its calculating edge and held something simpler, darker. Third, you help me cleanse this kingdom. You help me protect the people they are stealing from, the soldiers they are undermining, the legacy my father built. You use your talents not just for revenge on a few bad men, but for justice. He leaned back, the offer hanging in the fire-warmed air. Work with me. Be my spy master in the shadows, and in exchange, I will give you the one thing a fox on the run can never have, a den that is truly safe, a home. The silence that followed was immense. The crackle of the fire was the only sound. I looked at this king, this man who had worn a mask of weakness to see the truth of his court, who had seen the truth of me and hadn't recoiled, but had seen use. It was not a gentle offer. It was a pact with a wolf, dangerous, potentially deadly, but he was offering what I truly stole for in every noble house I'd ever robbed. Safety, justice, a place to belong. I looked down at my muddy, scarred hands, the hands of a thief. He was asking me to use them to build something, instead of just tearing things down. I lifted my head and met the gaze of the Alpha King. The bird hung in the air, a fragile bridge between our 2 worlds. Yes. He didn't smile. He didn't look triumphant. He gave a single slow nod, as if I had confirmed a fact he already knew. Good. The next hour was spent in the rapid, quiet dissolution of the old world and the stark outline of the new. He stood and went to a heavy, locked chest in the corner. With a key from a chain around his neck, he opened it. Inside were not jewels or gold, but scrolls, dossiers, maps, the inner workings of his kingdom. He pulled out a rolled parchment and spread it on a small table between our chairs. It was a map of Stonehaven Castle, but unlike any I had ever seen. It was a labyrinth of secrets. The official corridors were drawn in thin black ink, overlaid in a careful blood-red ink were the secret passages, the ones I had guessed at, and dozens more I had never imagined. Priest holes, smuggling tunnels from centuries past, hollow walls and listening tubes that snaked through the stone like veins. My ancestors believed in having eyes everywhere, he said, his finger tracing a red line that ran behind the wall of Lord Grayson's study. I know the theory of these, but knowing a tunnel exists and moving through it unseen are different skills. He looked at me. This is where we begin. You will teach me to be a ghost in my own home. And so, an unlikely education started. By day, I was Lily the Maid, musy and mute. By night, in the deepest hours, I became the tutor to a king. Our first lesson was silence, not just quiet feet, but the silence of breath, of fabric, of intention. In a stone passage so narrow, our shoulders brushed, I showed him how to place each foot, rolling from heel to toe, feeling for the grain of the stone that wouldn't cry out. I watched the mighty Alpha King, a man who commanded armies with a shout, learn to exhale so softly it made no mist in the cold air. You think like a soldier, I whispered in the dark one night, after he'd shifted his weight and a pebble had skittered away. You think of conquering the space. You must think of being part of it. A shadow doesn't conquer the wall, it becomes one with it. He grunted, a sound of frustration and focus. He was not a natural at this. He was too big, too present. But he was also the most relentless student I could imagine. He practiced a single soundless step for an hour until he was satisfied. In return, he taught me the castle's heartbeat, Not the stones, but the people in them. In the south sitting room, he would point to a name on a list. Baroness Alara, he said, tapping the parchment. She is not our enemy. Her pity for me is real. Her grief over her lost son makes her blind to her steward's theft, a target for sympathy, not confrontation. He explained the complex web of alliances and grudges, showing me which whispers were meaningless gossip and which held the seeds of betrayal. He gave context to the greed I had seen. It was no longer just a room of valuables to be assessed. It was a puzzle of human weakness to be understood. One night we found a forgotten tunnel that ended behind a tapestry in the Royal Library. It was thick with dust and cobwebs, unused for a century, a perfect place to talk. This changes nothing of our public faces, he said, leaning against the cold stone. Soot smudged his cheek, and he looked more like a brigand than a king. You must continue to be invisible, more than ever. If they suspect you are more than a maid, the game is over. I know how to be invisible, I said, a touch of the fox's pride in my voice. You do, he acknowledged, but you've never had to do it while secretly holding a king's trust. It's a heavier cloak to wear. The words king's trust hung between us. That was the true terrifying new element. I was used to relying only on myself. Now my safety, my pardon, my future were tied to this man and his dangerous game. And his survival, it seemed, was now partly tied to my skills. It was a fragile, terrifying symbiosis. One evening, during a lesson on lockpicking using a set of ancient complex locks he'd procured, my hands fumbled. I was tired, the weight of the double life pressing down. A thin, sharp pick slipped and jabbed deep into the pad of my thumb. I hissed, sucking in a breath, a bright bead of blood welling up. Before I could shake it away, his hand closed around my wrist. His grip was firm, but not harsh. Let me see. It's nothing, I said, trying to pull back. My scars were one thing, old history. This was a fresh vulnerability, happening right in front of him. He ignored me, examining the small puncture. His thumb, calloused and warm, brushed away the blood. The touch was startling in its simplicity. He wasn't the king in that moment or the student. He was just a man seeing a small injury. Even ghosts can bleed, Fox, he murmured. He released my hand and tore a clean strip from the hem of his own dark tunic. A king ruining his clothes for a thief's prick. Wrap it. A blood trail is the worst kind of noise. I took the cloth, my face hot for reasons that had nothing to do with the close air of the passage. The moment was over as quickly as it came. He was back to the lock, his brow furrowed. Now, show me again how you tension the torsion wrench. I believe my grip is too strong. But something had shifted. The partnership was no longer just a theoretical bargain, a map and a plan. It was calloused hands learning delicate work. It was a shared silence in the dark. It was the offering of cloth for blood. We were no longer just the king and the fox, the stag and the shadow. We were becoming partners, and in the silent, secret heart of the castle, that was a more dangerous and powerful thing than either of us had ever been alone. Weeks blurred into a strange, double-edged rhythm. By day, the castle was a stage where we performed our tired old roles with meticulous care. I'd drop a tray with a clatter, earning a hissed curse from the cook. He'd let his hand tremble spilling wine, and a servant would rush forward with false, cloying sympathy. The disdain in the court grew thicker, a poison we willingly breathed. By night we were alive. The secret passages became our kingdom. We didn't just map them, we lived in them. We found a small dusty alcove off the old grain chute, with a vent that overlooked the main garrison hall. It became our listening post. For hours, we'd sit shoulder to shoulder in the dark, listening to the off-duty guards. Their complaints about the useless king were acid to my soul, but Viktor's face, lit by the sliver of light from the vent, would remain a mask of cold, detached analysis. Hear how Sergeant Brant mocks my weakness, he'd whisper, his breath stirring the dust near my ear. But note he never refuses his pay, which Grayson has just increased. Loyalty bought with stolen coin is no loyalty at all. He was teaching me to listen past the insult to the intent, past the greed to the source. In return, I taught him how to become heir. He learned to pick the simple lock on Grayson's servant's entrance in under a minute. He learned to melt into a doorway's shadow so completely that a patrolling guard passed within a foot of him and noticed nothing. The trust between us was no longer a spoken bargain. It was the shared rhythm of our breathing in the dark. It was the way he'd fall back without question when I lifted a hand, sensing a sound he hadn't caught. It was the way I'd look to him after deciphering a coded phrase from a guard's drunken rant. And he'd nod, connecting it to a ledger entry or a missing shipment. The careful wall between King Viktor and the fox began to erode stone by stone in the dark. He was just Viktor, a man with a sharp mind and a sharper purpose. And I was just Lily. Not the mouse, but the person I'd buried years ago. Clever, observant, dry-witted. One night, high in the narrow watch passage that rimmed the Great Hall's ceiling, we were tracking Lord Grayson's movements after a late council. The passage was a tight squeeze, barely wide enough for one. Viktor was ahead. Below, Grayson was speaking in low, urgent tones with his treasurer. Viktor leaned forward, straining to hear. His boot, placed on a warped board centuries old, pressed down. The sound was a gunshot in the silence. Crack. A long, splintering snap echoed in the hollow space between the ceiling and the hall's vaulted roof. Dust showered down. Below, Grayson and the treasurer fell silent, then looked up, their faces wary. Rats, Grayson spat, but his eyes were narrow, scanning the shadows above the carved beams, the places falling apart without a firm hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. We were exposed. One glance at the right angle, one curious guard sent to investigate. Viktor was frozen, his body taut with the realization of his mistake. The sound had been a declaration, someone is here. I didn't think. I acted. From behind him, I reached around and clamped my hand over his mouth. I pressed my body against his back, pushing him flat against the wall into the deepest pool of shadow. My other hand went to his side, pinning his cloak so it wouldn't rustle. Don't move a muscle, I breathed into his ear, my voice the barest thread of sound. He went utterly still. Not just still, he seemed to stop breathing. I could feel the frantic beat of his heart against my arm, the coiled strength in his back, held in perfect, absolute check. Below, Grayson stared up for a long, tense minute. The treasurer fidgeted. Finally, Grayson shook his head. This damp rot is everywhere. Come, we'll talk in my chambers. Their footsteps faded. We didn't move for a full 5 minutes after the door closed. The only sound was the slow, settling sigh of ancient dust. My cheek was pressed against the rough wool of his cloak. My hand was still over his mouth. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my palm, the surprising softness of his lips. Slowly, carefully, I loosened my grip and pulled back. He turned his head. Our faces were inches apart in the gloom. The sliver of moonlight from a ventilation grate cut across his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a king or a student or a strategist. They were wide with a shock that had nothing to do with Grayson. In that moment, the last mask between us shattered. He wasn't looking at me as his spy master or his maid. He was looking at the woman whose body had just pressed against his, whose hand had silenced him, whose instinct had saved our necks. The shock in his eyes softened into something else, a dawning, profound recognition. You, he began, his voice gravel rough from stillness. You stepped on the wrong board, I finished for him, my own voice unsteady. The closeness, the adrenaline, the feel of him was still humming in my veins. A slow, real smile broke over his face. It wasn't sharp or calculating, it was warm, amazed, and it lit up the dark passage. And you moved like lightning. He shook his head, a low chuckle escaping him. I have never in my life had someone cover my mouth and shove me into a wall. The absurdity of it, the mighty Alpha King, manhandled by his maid in a dusty attic, hit us both at once. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, tight and strange after so long. I tried to stifle it, but it escaped, a bright, helpless sound in the dark. He didn't just laugh, he howled with it, a silent, shaking laughter that made him grip the beam above us for support. Tears of mirth gleamed in the moonlight on his cheeks. We clung there in the shadows, two conspirators laughing at the sheer mad danger of it all, at the broken board and the shared panic and the shocking intimacy of survival. When the laughter finally subsided, leaving us breathless and grinning, the air was different, cleared. The last pretense was gone. He looked at me, his amber eyes clear and open. Lily, he said, and my name on his lips was not a command or a label. It was an acknowledgement of all of me. Viktor, I whispered back. The name of the king, spoken in the dark by the thief. He didn't correct me, he just nodded. We didn't need the maps or the lessons that night. We simply made our way back through the passages, moving together with a new, unspoken synchrony. The fox and the stag were gone. It was just Viktor and Lily now. And the game had changed forever. The morning after the ceiling beam cracked, the air in the castle felt charged, like the moment before a summer storm. The world outside our hidden passages had shifted. We were no longer just partners in a plan. We were co-conspirators who had shared air so close it became one breath. The memory of his silent laughter shook something loose inside me. I felt lighter, sharper. He found me in the south sitting room at dawn, already dressed in his crippled king robes, but his eyes were alive. "It's time," he said without preamble. "We have the names from the ledgers. We know the players. Now we need the final proof. Something that ties Grayson and his circle directly to treason, not just theft. We need them to confess to the crown." "They won't just confess," I said, automatically slipping into our nighttime mode of planning despite the daylight. "No," he agreed, a predatory gleam in his eye. "They'll confess to each other, and we will be listening." The plan was audacious. It required my skills as a forger, not just a thief. Viktor provided a sample of his own handwriting, the strong, decisive script of the king he truly was, not the shaky marks he'd been faking. On a scrap of priceless vellum, I crafted a note. It was a work of art. It spoke of a secret meeting, of final plans to be made, of a vault beneath the old watchtower where the king's last reserves of gold and magic were hidden. It was vague enough to be tantalizing, specific enough to feel real. It was signed with a rough approximation of the seal of a dead, loyal nobleman, a seal Grayson would recognize and believe was beyond Viktor's ability to replicate. "The bait," Viktor murmured, holding the cooled, forged wax seal up to the window. "They are greedy. Greedy men see gold where there is only shadow." My part was the delivery. While Viktor held a mournful public court in the main hall, listening to petty disputes with an air of pathetic weariness, I became a ghost in the servants' quarters. I didn't need lockpicks. I needed gossip. I spilled a bucket of soapy water accidentally near the chambermaids who serviced Grayson's allies. As we mopped it up, my voice trembling, I let slip a terrified confession. I'd been fetching linens from the abandoned West Wing and had heard strange, echoing voices near the old watchtower cellar. "Like ghosts planning something," I whispered, wide-eyed. "I'm too scared to tell the guards." The seed was planted. Within hours, the castle's undercurrent of whispers changed direction, flowing toward the promise of hidden treasure. The final piece was the stage. The old watchtower cellar was perfect, dank, forgotten, and most importantly, riddled with the hollow walls and disused chimneys that made for perfect eavesdropping. For 2 nights, Viktor and I worked there, not as king and spy, but as stagehands. We carefully arranged a few old, empty chests to look recently disturbed. We scattered a handful of tarnished copper coins in a corner, and in the deepest, most promising-looking shadowy alcove, we placed a heavy, locked iron box. Empty but impressive. Then we took our positions. There was a narrow gap in the stonework where an old flue for a long-dead forge snaked up the wall. It created a perfect sound channel from the cellar floor to a small, hidden ledge 10 feet above. It was a tight, uncomfortable perch, but it made you a ghost in the room. The night of the planned meeting arrived. The castle slept, or pretended to. Viktor and I were already in place on the ledge, pressed together in the cold, stale dark. We didn't speak. We barely breathed. The only warmth was where our bodies touched, shoulder to hip. The silence was a living thing, stretched taut. Then the scrape of the cellar door. Torchlight flared below, painting dancing shadows on the wet stone walls. Lord Grayson entered, followed by his treasurer, the captain of the outer guard, and 2 other nobles whose loyalty Viktor had doubted. They looked nervous, excited, their eyes glittering with avarice in the torchlight. "It's true," the treasurer hissed, spotting the chests. "The fool king hid his last wealth down here." Grayson strode to the iron box, testing its weight. The note said the plans would be here. The final arrangements for when the invalided king meets his unfortunate accident. His voice was cold, clean of the false pity he used in court. "With this gold, we can buy the remaining loyalists. The throne will be mine within the fortnight." On the ledge, I felt Viktor go absolutely rigid. Hearing the treason spoken aloud was different from suspecting it. A low, almost subsonic growl vibrated through the stone where I leaned against him. I didn't think. I slid my hand down, finding his where it was clenched into a white-knuckled fist on his thigh. I laced my cold fingers through his, a silent anchor in the storm of his rage. He jerked at the touch, then his hand turned, gripping mine with a desperate, grateful strength. Below, they were talking freely now, emboldened by the dark and their shared corruption. They discussed the poisoning of the king's wine steward, the bribing of the gate guards for the night of the coup, the division of the kingdom's treasury. Names, dates, plans. It was a full confession, echoing perfectly up the stone flue. Then the guard captain knelt by the iron box. "The lock is simple," he grunted, pulling out a set of picks. My heart stuttered. That was my lock. A simple Bransford, but one I'd oiled to open silently. If he opened it and found it empty too quickly, the spell might break. They might panic, flee before. Victor's hand squeezed mine once, a signal. Now. He let go of my hand and reached for the small, heavy sack at his feet. Inside were a dozen river stones. As the guard below fiddled with the lock, Victor leaned to the very edge of our ledge. With a careful, rolling motion of his wrist, he dropped a single stone down the flue. It fell for a long second before hitting with a loud, echoing clack somewhere deep in the unseen bowels of the forge system. The men below froze. "What was that?" one noble whispered, terror in his voice. "Rats! Old stones," Grayson snapped, but he looked uneasily at the dark mouths of the chimneys. Victor dropped another clack! Clatter! "This place is unstable," the treasurer hissed, backing toward the door. "We have what we came for. The plan is confirmed. Let's go. Clack! Clack, clack." The sounds were unnerving, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was the sound of the castle itself groaning, of secrets shifting in the dark. The perfect psychological weapon. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized them. The guard captain abandoned the lock. "We're leaving." They scrambled for the door, their treasure forgotten, their conspiracy laid bare not by a sword, but by the eerie, echoing clacks of stones in the dark. The door slammed shut, leaving the cellar in silence once more, the torch they dropped guttering on the floor. In the sudden quiet on the ledge, the only sound was our ragged breathing. The tension that had held us like a drawn bowstring snapped. A giddy, disbelieving relief flooded in. I turned my head. His face was inches from mine, lit by the faint dancing glow from the dying torch below. His eyes were blazing with triumph, with fury, with a wild, shared energy. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We had done it. We had set the trap, and the rats had run straight into it, confessing everything. The proof was in our minds, in the shared memory of their treasonous words. His hand came up, cupping the side of my face. His palm was rough, warm, trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. My breath caught. The world narrowed to the feel of his skin against mine, the amber fire in his eyes, the charged space between our lips. The fox had helped the stag catch his prey. And in the aftermath, in the dark, we were just Victor and Lily, victorious and alive, and something new and terrifying and wonderful hung in the balance, waiting to be claimed. The victory in the cellar should have been sweet. It was, for a heartbeat. But the fire in his eyes, the touch of his hand on my face, it burned away the triumph and left something raw and exposed in its place. We pulled apart as if shocked, retreating to our separate ends of the cold ledge, the unspoken thing between us now a third presence in the dark. The next day, the castle was a drumskin pulled tight. Grayson and his conspirators moved through the halls with a new jittery energy. Their greed had curdled into paranoia. They jumped at shadows, snapped at servants. The eerie echoes in the cellar had done their work. The trap was sprung, but the prey was now cornered and dangerous. Our plan entered its final, most delicate phase. We had the confession. Now we needed irrefutable physical proof to present to the remaining loyal council members. We needed the real ledger, the one with the true records of embezzlement and bribes, not the false one Grayson showed at court. "He'll have it close," Victor said that evening in the south room. He was pacing, the crippled king's lethargy gone, replaced by a caged wolf's restlessness. Not in his study, somewhere in his private chambers, a safe, a hidden compartment. "I can find it," I said. The fox's confidence was back, a familiar armour. "No." He stopped, his voice firm. "Not alone. He's on edge. His rooms will be watched or trapped. We go together. Tonight." There was no arguing with the tone. It was the alpha, not my partner Viktor. The partnership had shifted again into something more protective, more fiercely possessive. It should have chafed. Instead, a treacherous part of me warmed at it. Grayson's private apartment was in the east wing, far from the king's rooms. We used a route so obscure even Viktor hadn't known its full path, a disused laundry chute that emptied into a linen closet near Grayson's door. It was a tight, dusty squeeze. He went first, muscles straining as he lowered himself silently. I followed, my smaller frame moving with more ease. "Show off," he whispered as I dropped soundlessly beside him, and I heard the faint smile in his voice. The hallway was empty. Grayson, according to the servant gossip I'd cultivated, I was at a late supper, trying to act normal. We had maybe an hour. The lock on his main door was complex, but I'd studied its type, 37 seconds. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges. The room was opulent and smelled of expensive wine and fear. We moved with practiced silence, a two-headed shadow searching the space. I went for the obvious, the desk, the bookshelves, the wall panels. Viktor, thinking like the nobleman he was, went for the personal, the bedside table, where the chest of fine clothes, the ornate frame of a portrait of Grayson's sour-faced ancestor. "Here," Viktor murmured. He was by the hearth, running his fingers over the carved marble mantel. "The dust is uneven." He pressed a cluster of stone grapes in the carving. With a soft click, a section of the mantel swung inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside was a ledger, bound in green leather. Viktor snatched it, his eyes scanning the pages rapidly in the moonlight from the window. A muscle in his jaw ticked. This is it. The names, the amounts, the dates, everything. Just then, the sound of voices and heavy footsteps echoed in the hall outside. Too early. Grayson was returning. Our eyes met across the room. The door we'd entered was impossible. The window led to a sheer 3-story drop. We were trapped. Grayson's voice was right outside, loud and angry. "I don't care about the kitchen's incompetence. I want a guard on this door tonight, do you understand?" Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. This was it, the fox caught in the act. But Viktor's face showed no panic, only a grim, decisive calm. He shoved the ledger into my hands and pointed to the heavy, floor-length velvet drapes that framed the window. "Hide? What are you? Now, Lily!" The command brooked no argument. I dove behind the drapes, pressing myself against the cold stone wall, the ledger a hard rectangle against my chest. The fabric settled around me, leaving only a narrow slit to see through. The door opened. Lord Grayson entered, followed by a hulking personal guard. He was red-faced from wine and rage. He took 2 steps into the room and froze. King Viktor stood in the centre of his rug, out of his wheelchair, the blanket of weakness gone. He stood tall, a statue of royal wrath in the moonlight, his empty hands held loosely at his sides. For a moment, Grayson just stared, his mind refusing to process the image, the broken king whole in his private rooms. "Your Majesty?" he stammered, the false pity draining from his voice, leaving only confusion and dawning horror. "Lord Grayson," Viktor said. His voice was not the rasp. It was the true king's voice, deep, resonant, and colder than the mountain glaciers. It filled the room, stripped it of all pretense. "You return early. A pity. I was just admiring your accounting." Grayson's eyes flew to the open compartment by the hearth. His face went ashen. It's not what it seems, isn't it?" Viktor took a step forward. The guard instinctively moved to intercept, but one look from the king, a look of pure, undiluted alpha dominance, rooted the man to the spot, a whimper in his throat. "It seems like treason. It sounds like treason. I heard you in the cellar, plotting my death." The colour fully fled from Grayson's face. He understood now. The shadows, the echoes, the trap. "You," he breathed, hatred twisting his features. "You pathetic scheming cripple. You tricked us." "A king does what he must to protect his kingdom from vipers," Viktor said, taking another step. He was between me and them, a shield of flesh and fury. "You are finished, Grayson. Your conspiracy is over." Grayson's fear broke against the rocks of his ambition and spite. His eyes, wild and venomous, darted around the room, looking for an advantage, for a weapon. They landed on the draped window, then on the space where Viktor stood, seemingly alone and unarmed. "Am I?" Grayson snarled. In a flash, he drew a slender, jewelled dagger from his belt, a ceremonial thing, but sharp. "The kingdom thinks you're a weakling. Who will they believe? A dead king who fell in a traitor's chambers, or the loyal lord who subdued your erratic final violence. He lunged. It was not a fighter's lunge, it was the desperate, clumsy strike of a courtier. But the blade was real, aimed for Viktor's heart. Viktor didn't flinch. He moved. It was the first time I had ever seen the true Alpha King fight. It was not the silent, careful movement of our passages. It was a blur of terrifying, beautiful efficiency. He sidestepped the lunge, his hands snapping out to catch Grayson's wrist. A twist, a sharp crack, and a scream. The dagger clattered to the floor. Viktor spun the shrieking lord around, locking him in an unbreakable hold, Grayson's back to Viktor's chest. The guard, freed from his paralysis of fear by his master's scream, fully drew his sword. Viktor held Grayson like a ragged shield. "Drop it," he commanded, the alpha power rolling through his voice like thunder. But the guard, loyal to his paycheck if not his lord, hesitated, sword raised. From behind the drapes, I moved. I didn't have a weapon. I had the ledger. I threw it. It was a poor missile, but it was heavy and unexpected. It struck the guard square in the face with a solid thwack. He staggered back, cursing, his sword clanging against a side table. That was all the opening Viktor needed. He shoved the wailing Grayson hard into the staggering guard. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and fine cloth. Viktor stood over them, breathing steadily, his gaze sweeping the room. He kicked the guard's sword away, then looked directly at my hiding place. "Come out, Lily," he said, his voice softening only a fraction. "It's over." I stepped from behind the curtain. Grayson, clutching his broken wrist, looked from the king to me, his maid, standing there in the dark clothes of a thief, his ledger at my feet. The final piece of the deception slotted into place in his mind. His eyes, full of venom, found me. "You," he spat, blood on his lips. "You filthy, sneaking little thief!" Viktor's foot moved. Not to kick, but to place his boot firmly on Grayson's chest, pinning him. He looked down at the lord, then at me, his expression fierce with a protective pride that stole my breath. "She is the Silver Fox," he announced, his voice ringing with finality in the captured room, my spy master and the saviour of this kingdom. In that moment before the guards he would soon call arrived, he wasn't just unmasking Grayson's treason. He was unmasking me, to my greatest enemy, and claiming me not as a possession but as his equal in the shadows. The fox was secret no more. She was a weapon he had named, and in naming, honoured. They came for Grayson in the iron grey hour before dawn. Not the castle guards, but Viktor's personal guard, the handful of men he'd secretly vetted and kept close, who had watched their king pretend to be broken, and who now moved with a fierce, silent joy. They dragged the weeping, cursing lord from his chambers, along with his guard and the treasure they'd scooped from his bed. The green ledger was carried like a holy relic. I stood in the shadows of the hallway watching them go. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. The secret was out. Grayson knew. The guard knew. By sunrise, the entire court would know that the king's meek maid was the legendary Silver Fox. Viktor found me there, still as a statue. He had changed into simple dark warrior's leathers. The robes of the cripple were gone, burned in the hearth of the south room. He looked like the king from the old ballads, tall, unyielding, his face a mask of grim purpose. But when his eyes found me, the mask softened at the edges. "It's time," he said, holding out his hand. Not to steady me, not to lead me. It was an offer, an invitation to stand beside him. I looked at his hand, then at my own, still dusted with plaster from the secret passages. The fox's hands, the maid's hands. I placed mine in his. His fingers closed around mine, warm and sure. He didn't pull me. We simply turned and walked together toward the great hall. He did not return to his wheelchair. He walked. The sound of his boots on the stone floor, a sound the castle had not heard in half a year, was like a drumbeat heralding a new age. Servants peeking from doorways gasped and stumbled back. A scullery maid dropped a pitcher, the crash echoing like a bell. By the time we reached the great oak doors of the hall, a crowd had gathered in our wake, servants, guards, early-rising courtiers, their faces a blur of shock and confusion. The news was flying ahead of us like wildfire. Viktor didn't pause. The doors were thrown open from within by his loyal men. The great hall was lit by the cold, pale light of dawn streaming through the high windows. The council was there, those not already in chains, roused from their beds. They stood in clusters, muttering, their fine robes thrown on in haste. At the front of the dais, in a line, knelt Grayson and his conspirators, bound and gagged, their heads bowed. All conversation died as we entered. 100 pairs of eyes locked onto the king, striding tall and powerful into the hall they had last seen him broken in. The shock was a physical wave. Then their eyes slid to me, the small, grey-clad maid walking at his side, my hand still in his. The whispers started again, sharp and confused. Viktor let go of my hand only when he reached the dais. He did not sit on his throne. He stood before it, a king reclaiming his place not by sitting but by standing his ground. His voice, when it came, did not need to be loud. It carried in the dead silence, clean and sharp as a blade. "For 6 months," he began, "you have looked upon your king and seen a broken thing, a stag brought down by treachery. You saw weakness, and in that weakness, some of you saw opportunity." His gaze swept over the kneeling men, then over the stunned council. "You saw a throne that seemed empty, and you reached for it. You stole from my people. You poisoned my court with lies. You plotted my murder." He motioned, and one of his guards stepped forward, placing the green ledger on the throne beside him. "The proof is here, in Lord Grayson's own hand. The theft, the bribes, the conspiracy." A lord from the back, one of Grayson's lesser allies, found his voice. "This is an outrage! That servant!" He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She was in his rooms! She must have planted it! This is the work of a thief, not a king!" A murmur of agreement rippled through his faction. The old narrative was fighting back. The broken king was gone, but in his place stood a man they could accuse of deceit, of using a common criminal to do his dirty work. Viktor's smile was thin and dangerous. He turned to me. "Lady Lily," he said, and the title in his voice was a shield, a coronation. "Would you care to explain your presence in Lord Grayson's chambers?" All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of their suspicion, their disdain, their fear. I was a nobody from nowhere, standing in a hall of power. The fox's instinct was to melt away, to become a shadow. But Viktor's gaze held me steady. He was giving me the stage, not to defend myself, but to speak my truth. I took a small step forward. My voice, when it came, was clear. It did not tremble. "I was there on the king's orders," I said. "To find the truth, you all hid behind lies and stolen gold. I am the silver fox." A collective gasp sucked the air from the hall. "And for the last month, I have not been stealing from this kingdom. I have been serving it. I have been its eyes and ears in the shadows you filled with corruption." I looked directly at the accusing lord. "The ledger is no forgery. The words are Grayson's. The conspiracy is real. And if you call me a liar," I added, a hint of the fox's steel entering my voice, "then you call your king a liar, and we both know he is not." Silence. Then, from the gagged line, Grayson made a furious, muffled sound, thrashing against his bonds. His eyes, burning with hatred, were fixed on me. He jerked his head, spitting out part of his gag. "Thief! Whore! She is nothing, a dirty little animal who picks locks and lies." Viktor moved. In 2 strides he was before Grayson. He didn't strike him. He simply looked down, and was it the force of his presence, of his unleashed alpha power, was like a physical blow. Grayson shriveled back, his defiance turning to terror. "She is the silver fox," Viktor said, his voice dropping to a low, terrible register that vibrated in the stone floor. "My spy master, the bearer of the truth that saves crowns. And you will speak of her with respect, or you will not speak at all." He turned back to the hall, his declaration ringing off the vaulted ceiling. "This is the reckoning. The season of lies is over. Let the trials begin." He nodded to his guards. They hauled the conspirators to their feet to be led away. The council stood in stunned silence, the balance of power shattered and rearranged before their eyes. As the prisoners were dragged out, Viktor finally turned to me. The formal wrath was gone from his face. In its place was a quiet, profound exhaustion and a question. The crowd was still there, staring. We had won the war, but now we stood in the complicated peace. He extended his hand to me again, not as a king to a subject, but as a man to the woman who had stood with him in the dark, an invitation into the uncertain, glaring light of the new day. I looked at his hand, then at the faces of the court. Some wary, some curious, some already calculating new ways to gain favour with the mysterious fox at the king's side. I took his hand. Together, we turned and walked from the dais, leaving the throne empty behind us. The victory was not in sitting on it. It was in walking away from it, side by side, into whatever came next. The days after the unmasking were a storm of quiet activity. Trials were swift. The evidence, the ledger, the testimonies of the captured guard and treasurer, the echo of their own words from the cellar that Viktor and I recounted as one flawless, damning story, was undeniable. Grayson and his inner circle were stripped of their titles and lands, their fate to be permanent exile in the frozen north. The lesser conspirators faced heavy fines and public shaming. The rot had been cut out, cleanly and finally. The castle itself seemed to breathe easier, the very stones losing their chill. Servants stood taller. Guards met each other's eyes with a newfound respect. The air of contempt was gone, replaced by a wary, watchful hope. They had a king again, a king who had outwitted treason from a wheelchair. But for me, the fox who had been pulled from the shadows, the world was a disorienting new landscape. I was no longer Lily the maid. The other servants looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear, bowing their heads as I passed, stumbling over calls of my lady or spy master. It was uncomfortable. I didn't want their bows. I missed being invisible. I was given a new room, not in the maid's dormitory, but a spacious chamber in the south tower. It had a real bed, a writing desk, and a window that looked over the forest. It felt like a cage made of velvet. A week after the reckoning, a summons came. Not a command, but a request from the king to meet him in the old library at dusk. I found him there, standing by the same high, narrow window I had once noted as an escape route. He was out of his warrior's leathers, dressed in a simple, dark green tunic. He looked more like the Viktor from the passages. Tired, real, the performance fully over. "It doesn't fit, does it?" he said without turning, as if reading my thoughts. The bows, the new room, being seen, I admitted, joining him at the window. The forest was a deep, living blue in the twilight. "It doesn't." "I know," he said softly. "I spent months not being seen while seeing everything. It becomes a habit, a sanctuary." The understanding in his voice was a balm. He turned from the window and walked to a carved oak desk. From it he picked up a long, slender object wrapped in soft leather. "I have something for you," he said. "Two things, actually." He held out the leather bundle. Puzzled, I took it and unfolded the wrapping. Inside was a key, not a tiny, delicate thing, but a heavy iron key, old and intricate, its bow shaped like a running fox. "It's for the West Tower," he said, watching my face. "The very top room. It's been locked for 50 years. It's full of old maps, travel journals, star charts and forgotten lore. It's dusty, isolated, and has the best view of the kingdom in Stonehaven." A faint, warm smile touched his eyes. "No one will bother you there. You can be visible or not, as you choose. It's a place to think, to just be. Your den, Lily, if you want it." I stared at the key, its weight solid and promising in my palm. A den, not a hiding place, but a sanctuary he was giving me. A place that was truly, completely mine. The gesture was so profoundly understanding it stole my breath. "And the second thing?" I asked, my voice thick. He didn't answer with an object. He simply held out his hand, palm up, just as he had in the misty yard a lifetime ago. But this was not an offer of help to someone who had fallen. This was something else entirely. "The second thing," he said, his amber eyes holding mine with a terrifying, beautiful openness, "is me. Not the king. Not your partner in schemes, just Viktor. A man who has seen every part of you, the thief, the liar, the protector, the saviour, and who would very much like the chance to know the woman." The air left the room. The key in my hand was forgotten. This was the uncharted territory, the precipice we had been circling since the night in the cellar. "The fox and the stag made a good team," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "Viktor and Lily, I believe they could be more, if you're willing to find out." I looked at his hand, then I looked at his face. No mask, no plan, just raw, hopeful vulnerability. This was the greatest risk either of us had ever taken. It wasn't a leap from a roof. It was a step into the light, with no shadow to catch you if you fell. But I had already fallen. Somewhere in the silent passages, in the shared laughter in the dark, in the fierce protectiveness before our enemies, I had fallen. I didn't take the key and run to my new tower. I didn't curtsy or offer a spy master's shrewd analysis. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, and he let out a breath I hadn't realised he was holding. He didn't pull me to him. He simply laced our fingers together, his thumb stroking over my knuckles, over the scars there. the history he knew and accepted. "The tower will be there tomorrow," he whispered, "and the day after. There's no rush." I nodded, words beyond me. He smiled, that true, warm smile that lit his eyes and raised our joined hands slightly. "Come on," he said, turning toward the library door. "Let's go for a walk. No secrets, no disguises, just us." He led me out, not to the secret passages, but to the main castle gardens, still silvery with dusk. We walked under the emerging stars, hand in hand, past guards who smiled and looked away, through a kingdom we had saved together. The fox had her key. She had her den. But in that moment, holding the hand of the king who saw her, she didn't need a sanctuary. She was already home. Did The Fox and the Stag's journey capture your heart? If you enjoyed their story of hidden truths and found trust, show some love with a like and subscribe for more tales where love hides in the shadows and crowns are won with cleverness, not just swords. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Which moment was your favourite? What kingdoms should we explore next? Drop a comment below and let's keep the story going. Until the next adventure.